Hello, my name is Mark Sturgeon, and today I have Ben Hawk, our data lead here at HarvestMax, on to go through some data he has compiled about a question that we often get asked in the spring of when is the most optimal time to plant? And we have taken a pretty firm stance on conditions matter typically more than the calendar. Now we're going to dive into 6 years worth of planting data, over 20,000 trial records, and a half a million acres to answer that very question. When should you be planting? And the big message that we have is that conditions matter more than the calendar. And we'll show you the data here in just a second to prove it. Today, we will be covering the planting window, where yield holds steady, and where it falls off a cliff. Yes, you heard it right. It falls off a cliff after a certain date. However, there is a pretty distinct time period where yield stays pretty consistent, especially on corn and corn on corn. Now, beans are a slightly different story, and we will get into that as well. We will have a crop by crop breakdown of corn, corn on corn, and soybeans, like I said, as each of those tells a slightly different story. Management zone performance, how our A, B, and C zones respond across that planting window, and what stays consistent. Populations by timing is another question that we often get asked of when we're variable rate planting, or as time has went on and soybean populations have gotten less. We've had a lot of questions on whether operations need to increase their population on soybeans if they're planting really early in the season, or as time moves on and we don't get that optimal timing window and due to rains or some sort of weather event, and we start getting into late May and early June, should we be upping our populations there as well? And we'll see what the data has to say about that. And finally, at the end, we'll wrap up with some actionable takeaways that you should be able to take back to your operation that is backed by 6 years worth of data. So Ben, why don't you get into some of the details as far as where this data is collected from?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Like you said, I'm Ben. Before we jump in, I just wanted to set the stage on the data that we're working with today. This isn't a small sample. We're looking at 530,000 acres over 6 crop years, 2020 through 2025. We have it broken out by corn, corn on corn, and soybeans. This data spans regional data across Iowa, Illinois, and South Dakota. We'll also be diving into some management zone performance by planting date, as well as getting into some of those population responses. One important note that I wanted to mention is that all yield numbers that you're going to see today are acre weighted averages. The reason we do that is to make sure that the larger fields count more than smaller strip trials. So this is going to give us a more realistic picture of what's actually happening at scale.
So, the planting window. Winter conditions are right versus what the calendar says. This is the core message of everything that we're going to show you. When the conditions are right, we need to be planting, regardless of what the calendar says.
Yeah, so this is one of the most important charts in the whole presentation we're going to show in this video. We're looking at here is the percentage of peak yield by planting week for all 3 crops, normalized to their best performance. The green zone on the left, that's going to be your optimal window. All 3 crops are at near 100% their yield potential when planted in that April window. The yellow zone there in the middle is that caution zone. Yield starts to slip, but you're still capturing 85 to 95% of peak. This is roughly mid-May through early June. And then the red zone on the right is what we're calling the yield cliff. And once you're past that early June mark, you're leaving some serious bushels on the table. But the key takeaway here is look how wide that green window is, especially for corn. There's really no reason to force a planter into a wet field on April 10th when the data shows that you can plant corn through mid-May without penalty. Not saying that's an every year case, but looking at this accumulated data set, that's the trend that we're seeing. So really plant when the field is ready and not when the calendar says so.
Yeah, and the one thing that I thought was pretty interesting here is when you look at the corn on corn or the red line, um, you notice that the yield curve really kind of wavers in those first 4 dates, and and then kind of flattens out once we get past the 1st of May, and then really doesn't tail off hard until the end of May. Just thinking back to some of the last 3 years around harvest time and talking to growers, and one thing that usually comes to mind that I usually get called about every single fall is crown rot lately and anthracnose top dieback. And if we really think about the disease life circle of that and know when these infections happen, most of these infections are happening in mid-spring, mid-late spring, when corn's up, um, and it's in that V1 to V5 range. And if you think about it, corn planted April 10th, if we get some cloudy, wet, warm weather in that late April, May time frame, and that corn is up and it's sitting in saturated soil for a prolonged period of time and it's been in the ground for a long time, those infections are happening at a very rapid rate. Now, the symptomatic um, aspects of those diseases that we see don't get exacerbated till fall after that plant's been stressed of trying to finish filling that ear out. And that's when we really see a lot of the plants either senesce early and then cannibalize the stalk, which in turn prevents stalk lodging. And it's easy to forget about what that corn plant went through in that April-May time frame and not relate that back to when we're in the combine in October or November. And if we think about that, that corn on corn inoculum is going to have a tremendous amount more chance of having that higher disease pressure than a rotated acre. The other thing that I thought was pretty interesting, which is not, I think Ben, you would agree, is not something we expected not to see, is soybeans, the highest yield is the first 2 planting dates, right? As we
Hmm.
get past that first early planting, yield continues to slip. And I think most operations that have tried planting beans early and they have avoided the frost, typically their beans yield more than their later planted beans. Not saying there's not some weather phenomenons that could cause um, later planted beans to yield just as well, because we've had some of those here in the past couple years, but as a whole, earlier planted beans typically yield more.
Yeah, so just to kind of expand on that graph, trying to put some actual specific dates to it, just looking at the overall trend of tracking these planting dates and crop performance over these 6 crop years. Um, for corn, um, you know, the data showing this is the most forgiving. You know, corn is holding 95% of peak yield all the way through mid-May. You know, that's a pretty wide window. You don't see a meaningful drop until about May 23rd, and even then it's only 10%. That 85% cliff doesn't hit until around June 1st, so corn gives you some runway, so don't panic if you're not rolling by April 15th. Corn on corn is showing a similar pattern, but slightly tighter. 95% holds through about May 20th. Once it starts dropping, though, it drops faster. Uh, by June 10th, there's a significant penalty there. Looking at the soybeans, though, this is where the data gets real. Um, Soybeans are the tightest window of the three. You're already losing 5% of peak by May 2nd. By May 17th, you're down 10%. And by the end of May, you're at a 15% penalty. So what this data set's showing us is essentially every week matters with beans. So you may ask, what's the practical implication? If you have limited planting dates and conditions are right, the data is telling us to prioritize getting soybeans in the ground, and that corn can wait. Diving in more, if you look at some of this regional data, all three peak in early to mid-April, which isn't surprising, but if you look at the difference uh, as they behave as planting gets later, corn and corn on corn both hold up well through May. The lines stay relatively flat through the first weeks of May before they start to drop. And then you can see that soybean story showing a pretty significant decline as planting date goes on, looking flat in comparison to corn. Uh, that doesn't mean you should plant at all costs in early April. Just remember that conditions still matter, and if your fields aren't ready in April, the data shows that you do have time, especially for corn. Uh, with beans, every week counts, but you still need to make sure that those conditions are fit.
Yeah, and one thing that I want to point out here is when you look at the soybean line, if you really pay attention to the average yield um, line on the left, the y-axis, you'll see it's in 50 bushel increments. And you look at the peak at 74 bushel, that line looks relatively flat when you just first look at it from a visual standpoint. But when you trace that across, that last yield point or last planting date is 50 bushel, so almost a 25 bushel deficit from first to last, even though it looks like a fairly flat line compared to the corn.
Yes. So now we're going to look at the crop by crop breakdown, um, broken out in that corn, corn on corn, and soybeans, and see if the specific planting date response and key stats for each. So Mark, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, so here's first year corn on its own. Each bar represents a planting week's acre weighted yield average across all 6 years. And the key stats are on the right hand side. So the average yield over those 6 year period was 225.5 bushel on all of the acres of first year corn. And with peak performance coming in that early to mid April. But the real story is if you look at, once we get past that first April 4th planting date, if you look at April 11th, 18th, 25th, and then into May 9th, yield stays pretty stinking flat. And the yield spread from best to worst planting is 128 bushel. But most of all of that happens well after the 15th of May. So you go to the 23rd, the 30th, and then first into June. Those first couple weeks of June are where that yield deficit really comes into play. Now, one thing that I want to touch on is when we get into that first week of June, I think all of us can admit to ourselves that if we get into June and we haven't planted much corn, the conditions that we are willing to plant in the first week of June are not the same conditions typically that we are willing to plant in April or the first part of May, just because we're starting to push up against that crop insurance date, right? So some of that data could be skewed slightly as we get into real late May and early June into some less than favorable planting conditions. But the big takeaway here that we want to emphasize is corn holds 95% of its peak yield all the way through May 15th-ish. And that's a 6-week window from the beginning of April to the middle of May. So main thing that we want to emphasize here is don't force it. Get good field conditions with a favorable forecast, and then decide to plant corn. Because this is almost a quarter million acres worth of data points that we're looking at. So it's a pretty solid base to build a story on. Now let's look at corn on corn. So this is second year corn, same field, back to back. Average yield here is 221 bushel per acre, 221 and a half, so it's about a 4 bushel deficit over first year corn. Best planting window is early April, obviously, by the data, as well as first year corn. But if we look at the yield spread from best to worst, we're looking at a 218.9 bushel per acre. Now, we're looking at June 20th planted corn on corn. Obviously, that was probably a prevent plant play. But if we look at how the corridor or the core of these planting dates are affected. Um, it looks pretty similar to first year corn, where the window is slightly narrower than first year corn, as we're starting to lose yield a little sooner right after May 16th, and then once we get to May 23rd, May 30th, it really starts to fall off. Um, but the other thing I want to go back and emphasize, like I said earlier, look at that April 25th planting date. There's a couple years here where the Mother's Day massacre hit, and it hit really hard, where we got some very less than optimal conditions after planting, and we had to either A, go in and replant, or B, we had Pythium come in, and or crusting issues where we had some reduced stands in some areas that really hurt some of those corn yields from a disease standpoint. So again, if I was going to say conditions and forecast matter more than ever, it's going to be on corn, where we have that disease inoculum that we're going to be fighting with those seedlings in cloudy, wet, warm soils. Now, as we look at soybeans, it's a pretty clear story as far as planting data response. Average yield on 210,000 acres is 69 bushel. Peak planting window is 1st of April. 95% of yield we hit at May 2nd. And there's a 41 bushel yield spread from April 4th clear to June 27th. Now, that's $450 an acre in gross revenue. But by May 2nd, we've already lost 5% of our total yield potential. And if you look back at how that is affected on corn, we're way into the 2nd or 3rd week of May before we're hitting that 5% yield deficit. So we have advised a lot of the growers we work with, plant our beans first, and make sure if we're going to go out there early, that conditions are fit. Because this is 210,000 acres over 6 years that we have compiled, or I should say Ben's compiled, to show us a pretty straight line as far as yield degradation.
Yeah, so wanted to kind of explain the year-over-year pattern. I know some of you guys are probably questioning, is this just one good year skewing the averages? And these three charts prove that overall this is a very straightforward trend. So if you look at the three graphs by each crop, that's each individual year and how they overall trend. And you can see that some years are better than others. 2021 was a strong year. Some years are weaker. And that's the weather effect. We're not going to be able to control that. But if we look at the shape of the curves, they follow the same pattern. The optimal planting window is the same, whether it's a great year or a tough year. Early to mid-April peaks, holds through May, and then drops. This is telling us that the data isn't driven by one outlier year. The pattern is real and repeatable across all 6 years. Bottom line, we can't control the weather, but you can control when you plant within the window of good conditions. So that's where the opportunity really lies. So now we're going to look at how management zones and populations interact with planting date. So this is where things start to get really actionable. What we're going to do here is look at how management zones and seeding rates interact with planting date, and I'll let Mark dive in from here.
Yeah, so let's look at first year corn just to keep the same thing first. So as we look at this, we have A, B, and C zones. So A is our highest productivity acre that we are trying to maximize production by reinvesting inputs to do so. B zone is usually our average production acre, and our C zone is our lower production or more marginal soil types. The one thing I want to preface here is as you look at the discrepancy between each one of these zones, it stays very, very, very consistent up to May 15th. Now, once we get past May 15th, our more forgiving or higher productivity acres, they trend a lot closer together than our marginal or lower performing soils. Now, Why would that be? One thing comes to mind to me is typically our lower producing soils either have A, more clay content, B, are lower lying, or C, have some sort of, which both of those would tie into having some drainage issues of some sort. Um, and if we think about that, as we going back to what I said earlier about when we get into June, and if we're honest with ourselves, typically our acceptable field condition in June is not the same as when we decide in April and the first part of May. So some of this yield data might be slightly skewed just from the simple fact that I firmly believe that some of these C-zone areas probably had some sidewall compaction from disc openers running through damp soils. There's a good chance that some of those slots didn't get closed, which would accelerate that yield curve to decrease. Um, so that doesn't mean planting date doesn't matter for the C area, because it does. Um, as all the zones decline with late planting, but the relative ranking stays consistent. Um, Main takeaway on this slide is to focus your management intensity on getting the right population on the right acre, and don't try to compensate the poor ground with early planting, um, because we're only going to be able to get so much out of that acre. It's not going to close the gap. Now, soybeans. Soybeans hold the rank, but definitely the gap narrows as we get later into the season. If we look at our earliest planting dates, the gap between the A and B zones versus the C zone is pretty wide. But as we get into June, especially the first half and into mid-June, that 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 gap closes quite a bit. And I think that I firmly believe that is due to mainly getting um, canopy to canopy faster due to our increased population. So when we look at soybeans and we're looking at how we manage these zones, our A zone and B zone are going to have lower populations than our C zone, because our C zones typically are lighter soils, um, or poor drained soils, where either A, they're going to crust earlier, or crust worse, I should say, compact more, and or they're not going to have quite as much organic matter, being lighter soils, to where they're not going to absorb as much solar radiation, which then is not going to warm up as fast, and also not going to get those beans to canopy as fast. So I think that's a clear reason as to why some of these C zone, the difference between the C zone, B zone, and A zone close as we get further into the season. So going back to that question we typically get asked, should we be increasing our populations early in the spring, and should we be increasing population later in the spring as we move into June to try to get these beans to canopy faster? I firmly believe that if we have a very good germinating bean with good seed treatments, we do not need to increase population the last week of March, first week of April. Now, we have some 80-85% germ beans, then yeah, I would probably increase um, my population slightly in that late March, early April to compensate for that. However, when we get into late May and early June, I would 100% boost my population up 5-7% to try to get these beans to canopy faster, to absorb as much sunlight as possible with the shorter growing season that we have.
Yeah, so I'm gonna go back to corn and start looking at the overall population by planting date. Just wanted to give some context on this data set that, roughly 95% of this data in this analysis is variable rate seeded using our management zone strategy. So not a whole lot of flat rooted fields here. The VR prescription's already putting different populations in different zones. What you're seeing here is how these zones perform across the planting window. The A zone in green, that's our best ground where we're pushing populations. And in this data set, that is averaging around 36,000 seeds. The B zone is there in the blue. That's where we hold population. That's right around 34,000. And the C zone in red is where we're pulling back the population, and that's averaging around 31,000. The key finding here is that the VR prescription holds up across every planting window. The zone hierarchy doesn't change with timing. This validates the VR approach. We're putting the right seeds in the right places. But then that opens up to another question: is can we push even harder in the A zones? So if we dive in a little deeper on the corn, especially in the A zones specifically, where our best ground is, we're already pushing population. We will go in and put in a zone high check, where we're putting in a check block in this data set around 38,000 seeds, and then test it against the regular VR seeded A zone, which, like I said earlier, averages around 36,000. So at 2,000 extra seeds, we're seeing additional response, and the blue bars are the current VR prescription compared to that high check in green and the low check in red. So in April, the high check yields 253.6 bushel versus 249.8 for the standard prescription. That's nearly 4 bushel per acre, adding just 2,000 seeds. In May, the gap grows to over 5 bushels. This tells us that there is room to push higher populations in the A zone, and that the current VR prescription is good, but the high checks are consistently outperforming. This is just kind of to show you how we do fine tune prescriptions. This isn't a flat rate recommendation to say to push population on a field level. Just an interesting thing we found in the data as we work to tweak these prescriptions year in and year out. So diving in on the soybeans, this is the opposite of corn. Remember that our soybean VR strategy is different. We reduce the populations in the A zone, maintain in the B, and then increase in the C. And if you look at this data, it very much validates this. What you're seeing here are the three population levels. Green is the A zone at around 121,000 seeds. Blue is the B zone, around 138,000, and then red is the C zone at around 149,000. So if we look at April, the A zone rate and the lowest population is the tallest bar, 75.5 bushel per acre. In A zone soybeans, plants have room to branch and compensate. There's really no need to crowd them. Now, April beans at the A zone rate yielded that 75.5 bushel. May beans at the C zone rate yielded just 64.1. So we're looking at 11 bushel per acre advantage when we're spending less on seed. We know there are different zones, but this is the VR reallocation story. It's not about planting fewer seeds everywhere. It's about planting the right seeds in the right zones at the right time. Variable rate lets you reallocate seed dollars from where they don't pay, like high populations on A zone ground, to areas where they do in the B and the C.
All right, so let's dive into soybeans a little deeper. So this would be an A zone check. Fewer seeds, same yield or better yield. And right now, in the times we're in, the bean market just took a pretty large hit in the last couple days. Who doesn't want to save money on seed? And especially if they can boost or hold the same yield. So on the left-hand side, we have a zone low check that was planted at 115,000 population. On the right-hand side, or the blue, is our base VR prescription in the A zone of 127,000 population. So we're saving 12,000 seeds, boosting yield 1.4 bushel, which is a significant seed savings in one, but also a pretty good pickup in gross revenue just from the yield advantage as well. So can we reallocate some more of these seed dollars to make the bottom line closer to the black? So if we talk about this, the gold bar that you see underneath these two blocks says it all. 12,000 fewer seeds per acre, same yield. And we've seen this same trend over the 6 years worth of data in the 210,000 acres that we had on the original slides. So saving 12,000 seeds costs you nothing in yield. That seems like a win-win in my book. Now, let's go to some key takeaways. First and foremost, conditions over the calendar. We can't force planting into bad conditions, especially on corn. Data shows that there's a wide, safe window for corn. There's a pretty wide window for corn on corn, and if anything, the corn on corn window needs to be when conditions are favorable and the forecast is favorable, for sure. Now, soybeans, we need to get them in early. Now, next thing, number 2, let's know our crop's cliff. Corn on corn gives you, or corn, first year corn, gives you the maximum runway all the way out through mid-May at 95% of the peak. Soybeans, on the other hand, start losing 5% of their peak yield by May 2nd, and then tail off even faster as we go in time. So, when conditions open up, let's make our soybeans our priority. From the VR front, we need to push our A zones on corn slightly harder to maximize that return on investment when we consistently add 2 to 6 bushels per acre over our variable rate prescription rate. That not only tells us that our variable rate strategy is working, but there's definitely still room to fine tune. Soybeans, from a variable rate standpoint, we need to reallocate those dollars to make those acres as profitable as possible. Currently, we're overspending on most acres that are seeded to soybeans. We're seeing several low checks across several operations across the country where we're continuing to pull back populations in the A zones, continue to match or beat yield from grower standard practice. Number 5, VR validates across the window. No matter what timing we look at from April through June, variable rate planting pays. And I just want to circle back around that this data set that Ben provided us was 6 years worth of data. So there wasn't one spring that was exactly the same as another. We always default to, well, what's a normal spring? There is none. Over those 6 years, there's over 500,000 acres that went into this data set. So all of you that are watching right now should feel very solid and comfortable that we need to have the right rate in the right place at the right time in order to maximize yield. And this planning data set that Ben's put together, I think, helps show that. So, in closing, Ben?
Yeah, that's our data. I wanted to thank everybody that joined us today and took the time to watch this video. If you want to talk through how this applies to your operation, whether it's fine-tuning your corn prescriptions or reallocating soybean populations, reach out to your Harvest Max agronomist. That's what we do. We're here to help, especially put this data to work on your farm. So thanks again, and I hope everybody has a great and safe planting season.